This is so good. I didn't get Rasmused last year, but I got Benjamin decried last year. I'm so happy to see so many of you here. All right, so e-commerce and open source. How many of you are here because pot is in the title of this talk? I'm just curious. So there's a few honest people in here, and then everyone else, we'll talk about it later. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Ben Marks. I'm the evangelist at Magento, which is an open source e-commerce software. And I think if you're new to the tech world, probably evangelist is a great job to go for, especially if you don't have like family at home or anything. It just means you get to go to fly to places like New Zealand and give silly talks about commerce and pot. So a little bit more. I was a late bloomer in the world of programming. So I actually have a psychology degree from a college back in the States. And I used that psychology degree to become a professional musician for 2 years, and then eventually stumbled into the world of programming. It's a fun place to be. So autodidact. I'm self-taught. I actually taught myself PHP from the very beginning. I had a brief flirtation with Cold Fusion back in the days of like Cold Fusion 4, I think. But I taught myself PHP with this software called eCommerce. And I don't know, anyone, I see one or two like knowing grins that have been like, oh God, I remember that fresh hell. Basically, one of the best ways I can describe eCommerce is that if you're trying to teach yourself programming, that's the absolute worst way to do it. It was just, I'll talk about a little bit more about it later on. But I ended up spending several years unlearning those things that I had learned doing that. Brief flirtations. Really, it was the auto racing world, a couple of failed startups that really got me deeper into PHP. And then eventually, it seems like always, cycle back into e-commerce somehow. So I actually had one of my first e-commerce things was for a ticketing system that I built. And back then, this was before you even had payment gateway integrations into any of the popular e-commerce software. So like you literally just took some payment, like LinkPoint or something, payment API, and just bang it into whatever application you built. It's a really good way to learn to appreciate everything that e-commerce frameworks do. So this is, normally I'm up here shilling for my amazing employer, Magento, and talking about how wonderful Magento is. This is one of just a couple of talks that I do that really speaks to the heart of why I do what I do. So why do I care? Why do any of us care about open source and open source, e-commerce, PHP, how these all fit together? Well, I mean, quite simply, I have a pretty amazing career that pays for a very interesting life for me and my wife. I have many, many friends who work in this space all over the world, and they make their living helping merchants or helping agencies serve merchants in the area of e-commerce. I also care because this is not going away anytime soon. And I've got some stats that you can write down and put in your reports when you go back to wherever you got to go and prove that you were here paying attention and not off enjoying this beautiful Wellington weather. Above all, e-commerce it hasn't slowed down, continues to grow every year, probably not much of a surprise. And really, it occurred to me when I wanted to kind of dive deeper into this, that in order to get a sense of where we're going in the future, we really have to go and look at where we've come from. So we'll go back to the early days, probably earlier than some of you, if my ability to judge ages is anything. So we heard actually in the keynote this morning some brief mentions of some of the architects behind the web that we enjoy so much today. And I guess throughout history, like why did we start grunting at each other in the first place? It's probably to say like, hey, you have something I want. Let's figure this out. So in the world of web-based commerce, the first transaction, in fact, was for pot, right? So This was back in the days when the internet had like 3 nodes on it, right? Just going among a few universities and some DoD endpoints in the States. And you had the kids at MIT and the kids from Stanford. And the kids at MIT figured, hey, I bet those Stanford kids in California, they probably have good weed. And so they actually set up this transaction over this fledgling internet thing. And thus was born e-commerce. Literally one of the first things that happened was e-commerce. We should all be proud. They didn't have PayPal back then, so I don't know how they set up the payment. But this was defined by, just like the web was back then, or the internet, closed systems, large organizations, right? So you had these monolithic entities, whether they were universities or the Department of Defense, involved in controlling every aspect of what happens on the internet. So as the internet started to take off and the web started to emerge and become a thing, well, immediately people realized that this was a way to meet, if I've got stuff to sell, I can meet some of these people online and I can push my wares on them. So if you go back way, way, way back, you get this thing called Neutron. Now, I'm lucky that in my family, we were, my dad worked as an executive at a large bank in the States, one of the ones that failed, but he'd already retired. It wasn't his fault. And he was responsible, actually, for some of the earliest teller machines, right? So they had this thing called Teller 2. And I remember seeing little prototype components sitting in our house. Well, one day he came home with this box. And it was it kind of reminded me of a wooden, old Nintendo. And he plugged it in to the phone jack, and he plugged it into the TV. And my 5 or 6 year old brain just was like, wait a minute, those two don't go together. What's happening? Well, and I remember it was such a neat thing to see. But he heard this tone, this dial up, and then next thing I know, up on the screen pops this display. We didn't actually, I don't think we went to JCPenney, but you see news from around the world. You see, if you wanted to go into some of these big department stores, which is what JCPenney is, you have this category listing. Pretty primitive, but you can map this to what you know. And he's explaining to me how somehow this information is coming from a server out in California. We lived on the opposite coast, right? So California, North Carolina at the time. And we were communicating back and forth at the speed of light, grabbing information. And then to start to go beyond that and just say, okay, well, there's all this other information piping into that server. And you go, wow, okay. So this is an interesting first pass. Now, this is obviously well before we have the open web, right? This is back in '83. Web hasn't been invented yet. Well, then you start up, then pretty rapidly, different services come online. And they evolve quickly, and you end up with this electronic mall concept. Now, amazingly, what do you do when you go shopping on a website today? Very often, you still add things to a cart. It's still a very plodding arrangement that maps to the classic walking through a store and putting things in a basket and then going and checking out. And we're seeing that start to change, right? You're starting to see more and more. Amazon has been working on this forever, but the idea that you just push a button on something you like and you just buy it. It just works. It's taken us a long time to get there, though. So we're probably still closer as a species, as an online species, to the paradigm of the mall. And so there were other different offerings that existed back then. But then we get the web. And the web kind of changes everything. And I don't have to tell you all about this because you're here. But just in case you don't know some of your history, I mean, you got Tim Berners-Lee. So back in 1991, we get this thing called the web coming around. Netscape version 1 has SSL. Now, this is an important step in terms of accepting people's personal financial information. 1995, one of the interesting things that happened, the National Science Foundation, which was still kind of responsible for running things, the web, they had a long-standing restriction on commerce because they were worried that if they allowed commerce on the web, it would get cluttered with spam, which of course eventually did happen. But once this restriction was removed, Netscape had an IPO that peaked at $75 a share. It was massive, and it sort of gave everyone attention. It gave a lot of momentum to this web thing. Caught a lot of headlines, and people started looking at how they could extract value and interaction with people. And then, of course, June 6, 1995, PHP 1.0. So our early, I guess, waypoints along the way and our historical our journey. 1995, Amazon sells its first book. I mean, I don't know if you remember, Amazon started as a bookstore, not as a seller of buttons you can put on jars of mayonnaise and get more mayonnaise immediately. Amazon goes public shortly after that. 1995, eBay, who currently owns Magento, though not for much longer. So the very first device that went on eBay was a broken laser pointer, right? This guy just cobbled together, I think it was Java, it was like a Java program to list things and auction them off, and he just kind of, as a test, just throws up this laser product, this laser pointer. It's broken. He says it's broken, and someone buys it. And this guy, he's now a billionaire, he stops and goes, huh. I don't know, if that had been me, I might have been like, wow, commerce will never work because people will buy anything. Well, actually, commerce will work because people do buy everything. And then eBay goes public, and we have this whole history of stuff I'm happy to talk about, where eBay and Amazon and all these other players come in, and they start enabling payments. They start trying to make commerce easier and easier and faster and better for the consumer. So that's our history. I guess that's just where we come from. And the precedent that was set for people buying things online becoming more of a thing, and then with PHP, the power kind of shifts away from the vendors, right? So you don't have these things like Neutron and Prodigy and CompuServe controlling the experience. Some of you maybe came online and you remember connecting through AOL, and that was your portal into the web. And then eventually, you're just online. And with that openness, people have more direct access, developers, merchants have more direct access to just say, hey, if I can get them to my URL, then I can give them whatever experience I want. And that's pretty much key to where we're going. So to develop this talk, I actually went and talked with a lot of the people that I know in this space. One of them is a good friend of mine, Vinay Kopp. He's a German developer. Actually, he's half Kiwi, so and I'm sure that's his good half. He's been a hacker forever, and he goes back to the days of like Perl. He's a Perl hacker, and he will even tell you that he likes Perl, which says a lot about his Germanness, I think. So he did his first e-commerce project back in 1999. So this was on this platform called Intershop, and making plugins. So this was, the kind of he was a fledgling freelancer, and this was the start to his very successful e-commerce career. Another person that I know from the Magento space, Matthew Bean, this was it's a heartbreaking story. They put up a store, right? So they were selling, basically reselling Apple products. And it was great. They'd made this great thing. It was awesome. It was wonderful. And then they were one of the earliest victims of online fraud, right? Some Malaysian kids had some hacked cards, and it just went through the system. They shipped out a bunch of stuff. They couldn't claw it back. And that fraud took that business down entirely. So you can see things have a little bit of difficulty and friction back then. It was definitely the Wild West. OS Commerce, which I mentioned. So this was one of the first times that you saw in PHP a project of real impact that was able to start to enable commerce for a lot of different merchants. And you have to wonder, why in the world would you bank on some project that's that's loosely coordinated, being developed across multiple geographic regions. And just take this risk without some big company backing this up. And I would say, I can only posit that it's because something I often say is that e-commerce is always, always, always a custom job. There's no drop-in, this works for everyone. At the very least, an e-commerce platform, whether it's a SaaS or it's a open source product like OS Commerce, has to have some level of configurability, some level of configuration. So OS Commerce actually took off, and it became very popular. And there are still some massive OS Commerce sites in operation today. The big version that was everywhere, 2.2, that was out in 2003. Then several other platforms came about based on it. So it took off, and I probably should throw in a code sample. It was almost entirely procedural, okay? Really not many classes, because it was started back in the days of PHP 3. But you can imagine trying to manage like separation of concerns. I mean, none of this stuff existed in there. It was just not unlike the early days of online commerce. It was Wild West. So moving forward a little bit, you get WordPress, right? A lot of us owe our careers to WordPress. So back in 2006, Justin Sainton created the WordPress e-commerce app, and you can see the stats here. Just this thing that he built ends up powering a lot of commerce online. This becomes a really staggering figure over time. So we started to see, okay, people with the strict catalog approach with OS Commerce. And then people have websites with WordPress. These are just informational websites. This is, then they get traffic. And then maybe you have a blog on like cooking or recipes, and people want to know where they can get these tools that you're using. Maybe you decide, hey, I could probably start selling these. I've got this many people coming to my website. So they enable, install WordPress's e-commerce, and you get, boom, you get e-commerce on your WordPress site. And so you kind of see a broadening of the information involved in selling people stuff. It's not just about the catalog anymore. It's also about some of the stories. Another early player is UberCart. And so this is, UberCart was an early offering from this guy. He actually lives in the same state I live in, Ryan Shizrama. And so he created UberCart. He was working at a company. It's a great story. He was working at a company and actually made the mistake of telling the owners that the owners found out that he could program. And so they were like, oh, hey, sat him down at a keyboard and said, have at it. And so he started, in this Drupal environment, banging out UberCart, and then eventually said, hey, I've got something here. And he created this thing called Drupal Commerce. And Drupal Commerce is actually driving quite a bit of commerce even to this day. And there's a company around that called Commerce Guys. I'll maybe ask later. Is anyone using WordPress e-commerce? Yeah. What about Drupal Commerce? Yeah. Really cool. Would love to catch up actually after the talk and just kind of talk about what that experience is like. We all have a lot to learn from each other based on the frameworks that we're dealing with. So early PHP e-commerce. It's that convergence, right? It's taking the power away from the big corporate entities, being able to tell your own story, presenting a catalog, and then presenting information around that catalog. So then we end up, with these some of the SaaS platforms, like Creloaded, Volusion. I mentioned Drupal Commerce, not a SaaS platform, but you can see even to this day it's powering about 60,000 shops. Actually, I found different stats if you go to their website versus built with, but 60,000 shops. I'll take the upper there. You also have the emergence of I don't know if you remember back in the day, there was this thing called Urchin Analytics, and it was so good that eventually Google bought it, and that became the basis for Google Analytics. And then you also have the rise of, well, Google as a search engine. People are searching for products, they're searching for information, they're searching for things, and then you get this paid placement with AdWords. So we have the ability to sort of reach out to the consumer more directly, like right where they're in the middle of a search. And if you're working in this e-commerce space, you know that a customer who is searching for stuff, if you can get them the right information, they convert really well. I don't know how this got in here, but then eventually comes along this thing called Magento. And Magento is a great solution to a tough problem, which is e-commerce. So the idea was, it was an agency that was using, this agency called Varian, just started up by a couple of guys at UCLA, and they were serving sort of more and more large clients, trying to satisfy their requirements with OS Commerce. And they couldn't do it because you touch something here, it breaks here. It was impossible to maintain. And they said, hey, you know, it's been years, and there's nothing new in this space. A lot of people were trying, but there's nothing new. So they say, hey, Zen Framework is ascendant right now. Let's build something on Zen Framework. Let's offer that to the world. And it took off. They positioned it as an open source platform. It became huge. Powers 250,000 sites, you know, billions and billions of dollars in commerce. So, but their approach was very much like, some of the others, like a Drupal Commerce, where you have Drupal instance, and then you have this set of modules that enable commerce. It's the same thing with Magento. It's its own MVC platform, and then that was used to build an e-commerce application. So there were a lot of, it was written by Java developers, so it's very, very Java-esque. So if you're a Java developer coming into Magento, it looks very familiar. If you're a PHP developer, you're like, what the hell is all this XML doing in here? Happy to talk about that as well after my talk. So it became such a big thing that eventually they were acquired by eBay in 2011. You also have at this time, you know, sort of increasingly sophisticated SaaS platforms. And these are some that are based in the PHP world. Lemon Stand, FoxyCart, Magento Go, which is no longer around, sadly. We have some replacements for that, but they're not even ours. Along with this, you have a couple of App Store models. So WooCommerce certainly bears mentioning. And WooCommerce recently, within the last year, WooCommerce is really, really taking off. But the idea that you can have not just a software that drives your store, but then you can go out and just grab in one fell swoop some custom functionality, and that people can then make a living on top of that. And you can kind of see how broad this ecosystem gets. Right, so we've gone from merchants working with developers to present a catalog, to then being able to broaden out and include their content, to now being able to, you know, in one stroke, grab new functionality, and then the sort of the space of things and people impacted by e-commerce grows. I have some friends, I was just talking about this during the break, who have multi-million-dollar businesses based on Magento. Selling Magento plugins. And I'm sure there are analogs in the WooCommerce space as well. So that kind of carries us into today. So this figure's actually a little bit dated, but you can see there's a lot of money being spent online. And this figure bumps up steadily every year. You know, we're, I think, crossed over the $1 trillion e-commerce sales volume back in 2013 or 2014. We now have tons of resources in just in the PHP space. I'm not even talking about some of the facilities that exist with the other languages. So Magento, WooCommerce, PrestaShop, Xcart, Drupal Commerce, Shopware, and there are others. There are some coming up based on Symfony. I'm very curious to see how well those take off. Is anyone here using Silius? Everyone talks to me about how, like, Magento just does all these things wrong, and then they say in Symfony they hold up. But it's really, really hard to put a really good application out there and then convince marketing to buy it. That's the problem, is it's not developers who make these decisions. It's right, someone in marketing plays golf with someone else in marketing. They say, hey, you should use Magento. That person says, great. That person goes back to their Java or .NET team and says, hey, you guys are going to learn PHP now because we're going to use Magento. And I've seen it happen as a Magento instructor. I've seen it happen many, many times. But yeah, there are tons of options out there. Some of the things influencing this, of course, the population is expanding, especially the population of people coming online. If you saw Davey Shafak's talk last night, he gives a great keynote that lightning talk was based on. I highly recommend, go out, find video of it. Just talking about the importance, the power of mobile communications. And that bubbles up into our world as well. And the reason that I bring up mobile here, I mean, mobile is more and more obvious. But really what this does is this gets us into what I think is the latest trend that I see. It really explains why we have to have these interesting applications that can be expanded on, both by bespoke development and by these module developers. And that's because we have this cycle. And you probably, if you think about it, you can realize this in your own behavior as like an online consumer. So, you have an experience that you really, really like. Some, maybe there's like 5 different merchants selling the same thing. You have like a frictionless experience buying something. You like that experience, and so you keep doing that. Well, what merchants are always trying to do is they're trying to figure out ways to increase average order value, increase conversion rates, and they do this by turning us all into guinea pigs, right? I mean, maybe some of you are responsible for A/B testing or multivariate testing in your day-to-day job. If you're not, you should be. If you're dealing with users who can kind of consume your company's stuff or some other company's stuff, you should be testing. And so what happens is we go through this round where there's sort of a new normal emerges, like consumers expect this now. Another, the classic example is the one-step checkout, right? The one-click checkout of Amazon. So I just got a new condo, literally accidentally bought a stereo system, like a surround sound system. I swear, I just like was saying, I'll put this in like my cart or my wish list to look at later. And 2 days later, my wife opens the door and just says, honey? I mean, I didn't really regret it. I've always wanted a surround sound system, but thank you, Amazon, for that. So, but the thing is, it's like that's normal now. And we'll continue to do this. So merchants have to adapt to consumers who are adapting to the merchants doing their testing. And so we get this just ever more granular, like higher level of function and insight into into the ways that we achieve commerce. Mobile is one of these things, right? So having something that just works out of the box on a mobile display, on a tablet, on a phone. These are just one example of this never-ending, I don't want to say it's a battle, but a dance that we have where we just continuously improve what we're doing, what we're building. And I think that is the platforms that win. So we have these great SaaS offerings right now. So you've got Shopify, you've got BigCommerce. My marketing department would probably be having kittens right now if they heard me up here talking about them. But they're not videotaping this, so they'll never find out. Hey, Mom. Right, so we're those are options. But I think for a lot of merchants, those SaaS offerings, they don't do enough. I mean, that's the thing we hear time and again. It's just, and if it works for you, maybe that's the right thing to do, especially if the margins are right. But for a lot of merchants, it's just simply not an offering. They need that level of control because they have an ERP. They have, I don't know, any other number of things, right? So we have, I'll bounce forward, enterprise concerns. So enterprises are learning to accept open source. The client roster of Magento alone is very impressive. right? I see names, I get sales reports every day, and I see names in there, and I'm like, holy crap, they're using Magento. And it took a long time. In fact, Magento had to create an enterprise version of the software. It's still open source. It's got a restricted use license. But before, because enterprises, they don't want free stuff. They want to pay you money so that if something blows up, they can come after you and say, hey, fix it. PHP as a language, as a practice, is improving. Anyway, lots of enterprise concerns, processing lots of data. You've got these ever-expanding data sets, increasing orders and the amount of traffic, et cetera. Enterprise resource planning, you've got order management, all of this stuff that's really kind of tough to get to work with the SaaS offering, especially when you have to wed it to your business processes. And so these open source e-commerce platforms let you do that with varying degrees of fun and blood. So our future as developers is just continuing to solve these problems and be smarter about it. We're constantly looking to standardize how we do things. So great stuff that's happened recently with FIG, that's the Framework Interoperability Group. PHP standard recommendations, the PSRs, allow us to do work that can work outside of maybe the original context. If you follow certain conventions, when you build something, other people can incorporate that into their project and with minimal friction. So a couple of stories. I wanted to kind of collect more feedback from the people that I asked about this little project. And everyone's playing the long game, right? So like Ryan, he's sort of seeing all this good stuff that's happening in the Drupal world. And I think Drupal does, that community does an amazing job. Magento's kind of easy because we're a big company with big resources, right? When you've got more, I mean, I know you've got like Acquia and then you've got Automatic behind WordPress. You do have these big companies that have found this value. But it's interesting to see as these big companies come in and really kind of spearhead these projects, the character of the community. I'd say it's improved, like the communication that's facilitated. The resources that get expended on it, it's all for the better. And we all kind of benefit from this sort of race going from, among all these different platforms. We do have, I think, I agree with Chris Jones here that we will see the interoperability of different packages become important. So with Magento 2 coming out, you may need tax logic in your application. If you've ever tried to build tax logic on your own, you wouldn't be here. You'd be in a mental institution. Like, I mean, it is. I'm sorry, I shouldn't make light of that, but it's incredibly stressful. I know I personally had a breakdown dealing with sales tax and reporting in a bespoke project before. It's really, really tough, and you shouldn't have to build it. Other people have built it. Drupal Commerce, they have an incredible tax rules management module. So I'd say in the world of PHP, things are looking pretty damn rosy, right? We've got a lot of work. There are so many open jobs out there right now for people who need to hire thoughtful developers. And that's, we'd love to have you, of course, in the Magento community, but that's true, I think, in any, if you pick any major PHP-based platform and put your, sort of put your eggs in that basket, you'll find work, and you'll be able to have the pick of the work that you do. We also have a lot of the efforts from like Facebook and Zen with the development of PHP 7. HHVM is wonderful, PHP 7. If you haven't seen Rasmus' keynote of late, he's got some great stats on PHP 7 that are awesome. And then when you consider that it's still waiting for a JIT, it really looks appealing. So we're going to see PHP sort of competing at a performance level like it never has before. And so my thoughts on the future, of course, are Magento 2, which I'd love to take a moment to talk about. For us, so we're using Composer. We have semantic versioning. We've completely removed all direct coupling from the code. And that's actually got a configurable direct dependency injection system. We also have full test coverage from the core. This is one of the biggest complaints about any of the older e-commerce apps is they can't be tested. And if you think about e-commerce and what is involved, it's completely mad that it can't be tested. You should be able to know if you're writing something that's breaking e-commerce functionality. So in the future, Magento, and I'm sure some of the other platforms, if you're writing code to customize a Magento store and it doesn't have test coverage, it's not complete code. That needs to be the new attitude. And that's an attitude that has to change in PHP as well. And we have several people, several personalities working on that. It's coming out in 2015. We also have some other, we have some strong competition from WooCommerce and some of the other platforms. And in general, in the Magento world, and I think probably in some of the other worlds as well, we consider it to be more like co-opetition. Essentially, as we make improvements, as we up the game, well, other people have to up the game. And it's that same dance that we were talking about before.